So when we go to the Gospels, now that we've sort of done some ground clearing in terms of the sort of common misreading of the OT sacrificial system, when we go to the Gospels and how the Gospels describe Jesus's life, ministry, and death, what are we actually seeing there in relation to a proper understanding of, which you've already outlined, of OT purity laws and sort of related notions of sacrifice? And you alluded to earlier sort of anti-temple readings that are still kind of around now.
So one of the main points I want to emphasize in the fifth chapter, when we get to Jesus in the Gospels, is that Jesus is not anti-temple. And so fitting in his prophecies of the temple's destruction, like comprehending those, I mean, have to be understood within what I call the logic of moral impurity. And that has to do with those built-in limitations of what the compare system can handle. And so when moral impurity accumulates, and however we want to, like, it just gets too much, it kind of weighs on the land too much, and the result of this is the destruction of the temple and the exile of the people away from the land so that it can be cleansed, as Leviticus outlines, and then the prophets pick up. So Jesus' prediction of the temple's destruction is operating within the norms and the logic of the temple's sacrificial system and its own built-in limitations. But he's not supplanting the temple, and he's not saying this is obsolete, that this is bad, it's ineffective, or whatever. In fact, he affirms the sacrificial system's effectiveness precisely for what it says it's effective for, namely dealing with lepra, which is not leprosy. Again, Matt Thiessen's great on this, Jesus and the Forces of Death. It's what we'd probably think of as more eczema-like or psoriasis, things like that. Turn the skin white and make it look like a rotting corpse from the ancient perspective. So Jesus tells, when he heals, I go through this in the book as well, but when he heals folks with lepra, he says, all right, there we go. You're at stage 1. Now go do what Leviticus tells you to do. Go show yourself to the priest, go through all the things. And there's like a multi-step thing going on. So Jesus doesn't think the temple is ineffective for what it's supposed to be doing. The temple's destruction is not because it's ineffective. Like, it should be doing this. Oh, it's somehow broken or whatever. It's always been ineffective to deal with grave sins. And Jesus thinks those are accumulating, and John the Baptist as well, as the wrath that comes. So the temple is going to be destroyed, not because it's bad or there's a problem with it. It's just this is how it worked from Leviticus on. And so those sins, again, murder, sexual immorality, and idolatry. And Jesus does something very similar to what the prophets do. And he takes this, actually combines idolatry and murder. So idolatry a lot in Jesus to do with mammon and the economy and the money, wealth. And this is a huge critique in the prophets, that oppressive economic systems are basically slow murder of people. So that murdering that's happening, it's not just people getting shivved in a back alley. It's the system itself of economics and wealth gap, bring in some modern lingo, that fundamentally damages the land and the community, makes it and then makes what you're offering then is ill-gotten, not because he stole, but because it's based on a whole system in which there's no proper ownership of anything going on. So that's me combining some of the stuff I say in the chapter about the prophets and the prophetic critique, and then some Jesus teachings on mammon and murder and idolatry and all that. So Jesus is listing moral impurity, sins in his teachings as the reason for the coming temple's destruction. But so offering forgiveness of sins, forgiveness has always been something that can happen outside of the temple apparatus, especially because people sin beyond what the compare system, the sacrificial system, is meant to address. And I go through all the things there in the book. But when John's announcing the time of forgiveness of sins and baptism, and Jesus is similarly picking up John message there. This isn't some subversive thing of the temple. This is just, I mean, it's audacious to say, hey, everything the prophets are saying, like, this is it. This is the washing that we're anticipating. We're anticipating John, someone after me, is going to be doing this washing with the most potent purification agent possible, namely the sanctifying spirit, fire, and the sanctifying spirit. And so but that's not subversive of the temple, because it's offering forgiveness for the grave sins that led to the exile that the temple was never even supposed to be dealing with anyways. So yeah, folks are still trying to play this angle. I won't say too much more now about this, who I'm particularly thinking of, but there are still some scholars out there that too quickly think anything about forgiveness or something like that necessarily about subverting the priestly system and the forgiveness that is offered in the temple. And that's just because they don't understand that the forgiveness that's offered by the temple isn't for any and everything. It's for a very limited set of things, and precisely the imagery activated in John and Jesus ministries is building on the prophetic hopes from like Ezekiel, most prominently, about this divine washing of the Spirit that is going to be the signal of the forgiveness of sins that led to the exile. So also Daniel 9 comes in here as well. But so it's the forgiveness of sins isn't equal. I guess, like which sins we need to be talking about. And in fact, and so I pulled up here also what I alluded to earlier, Jesus' statement in Matthew 23:18, whoever swears by the altar is bound by nothing. Or you who say, so this isn't as woes to the scribes and Pharisees. You who say, whoever swears by the altar is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on the altar is bound by the oath. How blind you are! For which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift, that makes the gift sacred?
Yeah.
So that's, again, he's
Right.
drawing on Exodus, where the thing that touches the altar, right? So it's a sanctification of something. It's not taking something that was, yay, I'm happy, living, innocent life, dead. Like, that's not what's happening.
Yeah, right.
Right. From the, it's something that's
Yeah.
not holy and is being sanctified in this process, being drawn into God's presence. And so there we have it. Jesus is affirming that the altar is what sanctifies the gifts, and so and all this, and right there in Matthew. And then he also says, so whoever swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it, and whoever swears by the sanctuary swears by it and the one who dwells there. So he even still thinks God is
He's there.
there.
Yeah.
At least according to Matthew. Again, historical Jesus folks, whatever. But like the presentation of Jesus in the Gospels is not anti-temple at all. Same as Jeremiah's not anti-temple, just because he's saying it's going to be destroyed. Jesus, this is now me kind of quickly summarizing Thiessen, and hopefully my own summary that's in the book. As he's going along in his ministry, he's operating within the protocols of ritual impurity, and he is nullifying them at their source, but he's not taking over priestly prerogatives. So this is the other thing, like, oh, priests declare people clean or whatever, and Jesus never declares them clean. He just gets rid of their skin condition and says, you need to go show yourselves to the priest and go through those things. He's brought them into a state in which the priest had no role anyways. In Leviticus, it's like, hey, if this goes away, show yourselves to the priest again and be like, hey, look, it's gone. And then the priest will be like, all right, let's look. And there's a whole thing. I also outline that earlier in the book when we go through it, because there's some important things there. But all that to say is Jesus does not usurp priestly prerogatives when he could. There's nothing, he operates fully within, consistently with the protocols of ritual impurity and the effectiveness of these sacrifices to handle those sorts of things. He's also, there's sources of what we call major ritual impurities. So some ritual impurities go away with a bath and a sleep in the night. Some of them, they're so potent that the contamination goes away from the person's body onto the sanctuary. That's where you need a kippur atoning sacrifice to decontaminate the sancta there. Jesus deals with all those sources of major impurity, from leprous, one of them, genital flow is the other one, and the death. And so we have what Jesus is doing, and he's making contact with them, right? And I really think Thiessen helped me see that it's Jesus's contact that nullifies these forces of death, that then gets taken to its logical conclusion of Jesus's contact with death as death. And death as the way Deuteronomy names the height of the curses of the covenant. I gave set before you life and death in Deuteronomy 30, 15 to 20 there. And it's Jesus's contact with death that then it actualizes like the breathing out of the Spirit and the nullification of death and the conquering of that in the resurrection. And so it's this on analogy to his healing ritual impurities. I think as the Gospels presenting Jesus' death as the very means by which he contacts, touches down to the very depths of the consequences of those moral impurity sins, death as death, and snuffs it out and walks out the grave. So the paralytic walking out and saying like, hey, see, look, this proves Son of Man has authority. And Jesus walking out of the grave, it's like, there it is, that we've seen this happen. And this is the one who John then proclaimed. Like, he is the one doing this because, look, he's been going along dealing with the major impurities. And now he's even going to death itself. And death has all those meanings, not just, corpse impurity, but also like curses of the covenant and that whole bit. And I think, as I say in there, like Jesus' crucifixion from one angle, this will come up in some of the questions he says some readers have. So to kind of prelude some of that, the Jesus' death as death, like his death qua death as contact with those things. That's not in a sacrificial thing. That's how he nullifies the death. And then you celebrate that. You celebrate it with a well-being sacrament. Say, hey, look, he defeated death. This is the new covenant. Like, God's forgiven these sins. That is the new covenant. He's liberated us from all this. It's a final path. And so you're celebrating that by means of a sacrifice and saying, that execution, that violent execution and means of exclusion has been the very means God has used to nullify and conquer death as death. And so we're going to have a sacred meal to celebrate this.
We're going to party.
And memorialize. Yeah, that's the function of the well-being. You're memorializing a saving event. So the sacrifice isn't the saving event. The sacrifice memorializes, commemorates, remembers, celebrates the saving event. Yeah, and
which is fundamentally a liberative thing for
absolutely. And so this is why Jesus in the Gospels, I argue, is only associated with the non-atonement. When its sacrificial imagery is used, Lord's Supper, it's only associated. It's eaten, so there we go. Like, it can't eat in an atoning sacrifice for your sins, and it's on Passover. And he talks about a new covenant inauguration. These are two communal, well-being, non-atoning sacrifices in which the offerer eats, and that's it in the Gospel. I don't think the Gospels associate him with kippur at all. I think that only happens in 1 John and Hebrews. I'll tell you why, more in the book. In the Gospels, I think Jesus is fully he's operating fully consistently within both the protocols of ritual impurity and moral impurity. There's nothing subversive going on with the temple per se. That the temple destruction is coherent with the protocols of moral impurity, and then the sacrificial imagery that Jesus applies himself is the non-atoning sacrificial sacrifices, Passover, New Covenant, in which everyone's eating and celebrating the victory, the liberation that he has secured.
You have this really cool way of talking about Jesus's death that you've been hinting at so far, and I steal this from you all the time. And I don't always, cite my source here. But I want to say, if I've ever said this, this is where it's coming back to. Which is that Jesus died. Jesus' death is a death that's ahead of us. It's not instead of us. It's ahead, not instead, which I think is a great way of talking about this and kind of summarizing what's actually going on here. And this really rings of a kind of participatory account of what Jesus's death and the significance of that is for human beings and sort of the cosmos, I think, in general, that this is ahead of us and not as a sort of substitutionary replacement of something that we deserve. So how does this, if you could kind of sketch this for us, how does this account of ahead instead of instead work?
I've said this, before, but it's worth repeating, hopefully in slightly different way. Like the substitutionary aspect, I think what it's trying to do is safeguard the uniqueness of Jesus. And I want to say
yes,
is soteriologically unique, but it's a creative, it's a generative uniqueness. It's not a substitutionary uniqueness. And that's what I'm struggling. I was like, substitution is not the only word we have or concept to name uniqueness. And I have, it's not the only, and I think it's deeply inadequate. So here's why it's inadequate, because it makes us talk about the cross in such contradictory ways. I know of no Christian that actually will say, I've seen some weird things online, so I don't know. But for the most part, people will admit, like, we're supposed to be like Jesus. We're supposed to model, or we're supposed to grow in Christ likeness, right? And okay, that's cool. They'll also use the imagery of carrying a cross and stuff. And I think this is often way too flippant. And it's like somehow, at least in circles I grew up in after I was in these evangelical churches, like it's always been like, this is my cross to bear, and you're talking about some like pet sin you got. It's like, what the kind of weird use of taking up your cross? Like, oh, my cross to bear is just
people, or like people making me feel bad or something like that. That's my cross to bear.
Yeah. Well, people use it in different ways, but I've heard it said.
But
this is like, yeah. And so anyways, all I'd say is people know, Christians know that there, whatever Christianity means discipleship or life of following Christ, we're supposed to be like him in some way. Okay. Well, let's press into that a little bit. In the New Testament, what about Jesus' life are we supposed to be like or imitate? Are we supposed to have no homes and walk around all around? Like, is that what Jesus says to imitate? Is he say, imitate my diet? Which would actually be pretty cool. It'd be a bummer if he was John the Baptist and was only eating locusts.
Just bugs and stuff.
Yeah. Oh, man. Is that what we're supposed to be like? No, it's always his death everywhere. That's the thing. That is the reality within which we are supposed to be like Jesus, conform to the likeness of his death everywhere. I mean, I'm specifically right then thinking of Philippians 3, 10 and 11 and 2 Corinthians 4. But the shape of following Jesus is not just be like Jesus in general or some other aspect. It's specifically to be like him in his death, to join with him, and in an experiential, mystical, spirit-enabled union and thick living existence experience. Like, I don't know, like that's it. It's that thing. Okay, so what my problem with substitution is it makes you talk about the cross in contradictory ways, because they say, well, actually, it is the thing that we get to escape if you believe this thing.
Yes,
you get to escape the cross. He did that for you. He did that instead of you. That should have been you on there. Thank the Lord, it was him on there. You know, and they have these weird perverted ways saying that's God's love, torturing someone else instead of you. And people are going to say that's a caricature of PSA. No, it's not.
It's
because
not.
everyone who tries to hide from it
like,
starts describing the terms in such a way it's no longer penal substitutionary atonement, and they're holding on to that phrase because they think it's I know.
I want to just stop real quick, pause real quick, and just let people hear this, which is you can try and nip and tuck what penal substitution or some sort of related account of the atonement is actually doing. But the moment you're not talking about it in this way of a substitution that is, and I told you before that I didn't want to camp out on PSA, but just quickly, before we go forward, the moment you're trying to talk about something other than God the Father inflicting his retributive wrath on his son instead of us, the moment you're trying to step away from that and construe something kind of like it or nip and tuck it in a way and claim that that thing that you're doing is still penal substitution, I don't know what you're talking. It's not. You're stepping over into something else, right? You're trying to equate certain things that don't actually work together or soften certain things. But at the end of the day, if you're saying that God the Father is the one who executes Jesus Christ instead of us, apart from us, really, because we still have to appropriate that through our fidelity in some way. If you're not talking about that, you're not talking about penal substitution. You can't soften it by saying, oh, that's a caricature. It's not a caricature. That's how this runs. You can't just use the same word for for something else that's going on if the procedure itself is very different and also not premised on the same account of justice and the same sort of relationship between the Father and the Son in that kind of procedure as
Oh
well.
yeah, the
So,
problems here
yeah, that got me fired
manifold.
up. So yeah.
The problems here are manifold, and I've said this earlier, so I'll pick that up about like Jesus' contact with death as death and stuff like that. Okay, what is that? That's a sharing. That's a participation, right?
Yes,
it's a sharing.
that's right.
Down, and so there is like this is where some maybe progressive might not like my willingness to go here or whatever, but like there is a condemnation. There is like
of course,
covenant. I call it covenant curse solidarity.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what is Jesus doing? He's sharing in the
Yes.
likeness of sinful flesh, Romans 8:3, sharing in life under the reign of sin and death. And it's Romans 6, right now sin and death no longer Lord over him. He shared in these conditions. He shared in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple himself ahead of time.
Yes.
But Jerusalem wasn't spared. Disciples aren't spared. He's saying, you're going to go through this. This is the main thing.
That's right.
And in fact, I think actually historical Jesus probably more than likely thought, well, I don't know. I shouldn't speculate on this. But I do think there was a moment where Jesus thought, like, some of y'all, we're going to get crucified together. That's why I said, like, pick up your cross. Like, this is going to, and then they all flee.
Yeah.
Right.
But
then that doesn't go away. They don't go, Jesus doesn't go, oh, shoot, I misread that, like, as a human.
Yeah.
And it's just me. Never mind. Y'all are spared. No, you're still. So that's what I think is even crazier. After the resurrection, they're not like, whoo, whoa, wow, we missed that. Like, good thing we ran. They're like, oh, that's what we're supposed to do. That's what we're supposed to be and experience for the life of the world. Like, somehow we are sharing in this, and Jesus is already, that suffering's already pregnant with and bearing with all the sufferings of the world. It's God enduring the sufferings and the necessary death and destruction that our sin brings upon us and the world, and God is there with us, with us so that we can be with him and raised and exalted with him. That's not substitution at all. Is it unique? No. Absolutely.
It's unique.
Well, yeah, it's not substitution. It is unique. Yeah. Sorry, I talked too quick. But it's the uniqueness, as I was trying to say earlier, the uniqueness of Jesus's experience solidarity with us is that it's creative. It generates the very reality within which humanity finds its telos, finds its goal. Jesus isn't growing in the likeness of God as a human. Jesus is the art, like he is the telos of humanity always and already. His experience in the likeness of sinful flesh is borrowing from Nazianzus, who I think gets this. Well, he's like leavening humanity with he's sanctifying all that process for it. But Jesus isn't growing the way we are growing and transforming to his likeness. But that likeness is revealed in the shape of his death, in the shape of his life. And that's exactly what we're supposed to be conformed to. The cross doesn't name what we escape. It doesn't name the condemnation that we avoid.
I love that.
It's a transformative way in which God conquers death by death. And we are part of that and grafted into it as shared members of his broken body and sharing in his blood. Again, so Paul riffs on the communion eating shared aspect, participation aspect of the non-atoning sacrifices, and says this sustains and cultivates, and this story should help you realize what it is you're doing. You are being made members of Christ's broken body and shed blood, and you're becoming participants in that, not beneficiaries only, sharers, conforming, living out that the death of Jesus, the life of Jesus may be made known. And that's why I just have no patience anymore for substitution. Especially, thank God, where I teach. I don't have to sign these like weird statements and try to, like, that's why I think it counts for some of this like weirdness going on in certain things, because of very, very restrictive statements a lot of folks have to sign. So their job's at stake if they're not able to say, I say these words. And I feel bad for them. I never wanted to be in a situation like that, and I avoided places like that. But I have no patience for this because it's real. Like, it's real life. As when I used to be a college director, I say this in the book, and also, I teach undergrads, and when you see the light bulb go on, that they've been like, oh, I've been always thinking about the cross as something I need to avoid. Like that, I'm thankful for it, but like not as like the shape of my life. And so, the uniqueness is it's the source of that, of the very possibility of our sharing in that reality of us becoming who God has always wanted us to be, created in Christ Jesus in Ephesians. We are created in that person. to be like him specifically in the likeness of his death. So that I think the whole like I think you said like how does this like kind of work and come together? Well, it's a really intense metaphysical cosmological Christology about who Jesus is. That Jesus is the telos of humanity. It is, and so his entering into our condition facilitates, generates. That's the uniqueness. Creates. It's creative. You don't call your mother your substitutionary birther, as if you like. No, it's just she's your mother. She did something for you couldn't do for yourself. But like that's not a substitution. That it's a generative thing, and that's what Jesus is doing. And it's shared with us. It's always entangled in this double participation. A phrase I got from Susan Eastman, but
Susan,
slightly differently. Mm-hmm. She's I mean, she actually. Anyway, she uses, if you go and look at her, she has an article called Double Participation and the Responsible Self. And I like that article on Romans 7. What I'm about to articulate, I know from conversations with her, she's on board with, but she uses the phrase slightly differently. So I borrow the phrase from her, but to use it as in.
And apply it in a different
more
way.
More like Athanasius about God becoming what we are, so we might become what he is. And so it's participation always. Like there's at no moment is there an instead of. Is there it's always place sharing. It's always a with. It's always a such a unique connectivity and union. And that's all about this, like I said, this like grand cosmological claim about who this carpenter from Nazareth who got executed by Romans outside of Jerusalem is, saying that he is the one in whom we are created.
Yeah, it's crazy
from the beginning, and
you're getting at this.
Death,
you're getting at this whole thing that it totally shifts the way that we think about these things as Christians, and I think it should, because what you're getting at, I think, is that we need to be thinking about Jesus, this Jewish person from Nazareth, who was executed and raised, as the image of the entire cosmos. In the renewed cosmos, he is the one in whom all things hold together, which is a wild thing to say, right? That this person is the one that holds everything together, and we're like, nothing gets outside of that. Nothing gets in the way of that, as Paul will say. Being in contact with that is fundamental for Christianity, I think, and I think that's where everything starts from and everything goes back to, is that reality that we're all already involved with, whether or not we know it. Whether or not we're actively responding to it or not, like that, this is just the reality that we're involved with, right?
And that's why I understand people are amped up even against me, on the substitutionary bit and stuff, because they understand this is actually what it's all about. Like it's here. So if you whatever you're saying about our relationship to Jesus on this point is like, this is it. Like this is the it. What's it all about? What is this life all about? Well, it's about this. And so the stakes are high, right?
Yes.
And what I'm trying to show is that like people say, oh, there's varieties of ways to multifaceted meanings of Jesus' death. Absolutely. Amen. Yep. Several metaphors going all around. That's part of what I'm doing in my book. It's not always sacrifice. When it is sacrifice, there's different things going on here. Sometimes it's not even sacrifice, it's something else. But you know what? It's always precluded? Substitution. Substitution is always precluded. On its own. So even this is why I use Gathercole. Some people are like, oh, that could also be part of it. No, it can't. It cannot, because everywhere it's supposed to, it being substitution is supposedly found, it's not there. That's what I try to argue. In the go-to passages, this is substitution. No, it's not. It's always a with. It's always a place sharing. It's always a solidarity. It's never an instead of. And to Gathercole's credit, he has a really he has a really sharp definition of substitution, and talks about it's very nuanced. And what I just do is say, on your own, like on these criteria, substitution doesn't exist in the New Testament. It does, like on your own criteria, it's not there. And he said, so I'm going to read a quote from him real quick that I
please do. Yeah. So this is from his
Defending Substitution.
This is from that little like essay book thing that he wrote, right?
Yeah.
Defending Substitution. Is that what it's called?
Specifically with Paul. Yeah. In relation to Paul. And so I interact with his passages in the conclusion, and somewhat in chapter 7 as well for certain passages. But what I want to show is just what I've been saying. So I've been pushed on this on Twitter a bit, and when I've recently, and people say like, oh well, that can still be substitution, and I'm like, no, it can't. Gathical himself, like what I'm saying about that, like Jesus' solidarity and sharing in these cursed conditions and all that sort of stuff. So he says, Gathical says, second, conversely, one can have punishment or penalty without substitution. Again, I'd more use covenantal curse language there, but whatever. We will see an example, blah, 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 blah. Sharing with us, which Jesus identifies with us in our condemnation. He said, we'll see an example of that, as he's going through his book. He says, in this view of the atonement, again, there's that word use of atonement that I don't like, that causes confusion, but whatever. In view of this theory of salvation, we have Christ sharing in the judgment of God. But this is not in our place in the sense that he bears it and we do not. Rather, on this view, he would bear it with us rather than instead of us and accomplish atonement or salvation, reconciliation in that way. Because he identifies with us so completely, not just in the incarnation, but also in sharing the penalty of sin in death, he thereby represents us to God. Representation itself is not the same as substitution, however. And I'm like, yeah, that's all I'm saying. My main point is to say, I agree with that. I would, like I said, maybe.
Yeah, you could nuance certain things
like
or change.
Main thing there, yeah. And now the question is, okay, is there ever though? What then he goes on to describe what's substitution? This place taking, not sharing, not the with, not this identification. Is there ever a place where what I just read from it is not the case, and it's the substitutionary framework? Obviously, Gathical says, "Oh yeah, it's in these, it's in these bits," and I think no, you didn't follow through your own definitions. Well, you didn't follow the exegesis close enough. The substitution's not there. You only get this. In terms of like a grand story, like you get other metaphors, absolutely. So there's a variegated, there's that word. There's multiple ways of talking about the saving significance of Jesus' death. It's not just one paradigm. That's like people, what theory of atonement are you offering? I'm not offering any. All I'm trying to do is clarify the sacrificial imagery and get into some passages and showing how that's not sacrifice and that's not substitution. I'm not giving you a one size fits all theory of something. I'm exegeting certain passages, and I have thoughts, on some of these things. But what I think is absolutely precluded is any notion of substitution, of instead of in place of. That doesn't ever happen. We are already in the condemnation, Romans 5, that Christ shares in. He's coming into what we're already in the sinful flesh. We're already under the lordship of sin and death. That's that. Like, there's no redeemed us from the curse of the law. Well, Israel is already there, and that's only an intensification of when you look at the curses of the covenant, of the Mosaic covenant. They just map on to Genesis 3, and they're just parallel, which are then the antithesis of when you look at what's being blessed in Genesis 1 and 2. And so, like, what there's no, Jesus doesn't go anywhere where humanity already isn't, I guess, if that makes it like that does make sense. Yep. Yeah. Okay. And so I'm like, there's no substitution. But then the reason it's not just pedantic and semantics on this word, it's we are depriving people when we make this a thing. It's not even just that it's there. It's and now people get like so like I don't know if those familiar with oh, never mind. I'll avoid that metaphor. But basically, people get so amped up about it that they then make they make substitution the thing. Like, this is what we get. Like, that is salvation. And like, whoa, you've actually totally missed the whole plot, because the thing, what I was saying earlier, what is it all about? Is actually our conformity to Jesus. And that's not generic. That's not whatever. Like, pick the aspect of Jesus you like most and be like that. And there you go. You're like Jesus. No, it's specifically his death, sharing in his death. And this is all over the place. And that's why I outlined in the book. And so, yes, I am amped up about it because, and I understand why other people are, because we understand this is where it is. This is where,
I mean, as you know, you're talking to one who does get amped up about this stuff, I think, just as much as you do. And like, I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to point to is the idea of the heart of the matter really is that Christ's death is our death and Christ's resurrection is our resurrection. And this is breaking in now and transforming us and taking us on into a new reality where we live forever in perfection and fellowship with the one who has purposed this from before all ages. This is the heart of the matter for us.